Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. What kind of future are we building for ourselves? In some ways, that's the central question of this show. But it's also a central question of speculative fiction. And it's one that few people have tried to answer as thoughtfully and as poetically as Emily St. John Mandel. Mandel is one of Canada's great writers. She's the author of 6 award-winning novels, the most recent of which is Sea of Tranquility, a story about a future where we have moon colonies and time-traveling detectives. But Mandel might be best known for Station 11, which was made into a big HBO miniseries a couple of years ago and is now celebrating its 10th anniversary. In Station 11, Mandel envisions a very different future, one where a pandemic has wiped out nearly everyone on the planet, and the world has returned to a pre-industrial state, a world without technology. I wanted to interview Mandel for 2 reasons. One was entirely selfish. I love her books, and I love her writing. But also because I think speculative fiction can be really powerful. In fact, I think that AI is ultimately an act of speculation. The AI that we have chosen to build, and what we think AI could become, are in large part based on acts of imagination. So I wanted to talk to someone who has made a career imagining other worlds, and thinking about how humans will fit into them. Emily St. John Mandel, welcome to Machines Like Us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I just finished your first book.
Okay.
Last night in Montreal, which is a novel set in current day North America about an abducted child constantly moving around the world and the people whose lives she comes in and out of. And I know your next 2 books are also set in the present, in like our current world. But then 10 years ago, you do something that seems really different. You leap into the world with Station 11 of real speculation, right? Of imagining a really different world. And I'm wondering what about that time 10 years ago made you do that?
So what's kind of funny is that my original idea for Station 11 is that it was going to be set entirely in the present day. I had this idea that it could be kind of interesting to write about a traveling company of actors, just, little petty jealousies and intrigues and dramas that might come up on the road. I was envisioning this scrappy little underfunded Shakespeare company, in present day Canada. But at the same time, around that time, I'd been thinking more and more about the technology that surrounds us and thinking about the way it's oddly invisible, even though it's extraordinary. And, there are the obvious things like the internet. But then there are also just the things that seem kind of minor or that we completely take for granted in our day-to-day lives, but are actually quite profound. Like the way that if I were to go down on the street and get bitten by a dog, I probably would not die of a bacterial infection because we have antibiotics for that. Or, even just the way you can walk into a room and flip a switch and the room's flooded with light. So these little things that we completely take for granted, it seems to me that that's kind of the same thing as not seeing these things. So I thought, well, maybe a way to write about our technology, which is to say to write about the modern world, broadly speaking, would be to think about its absence. So I decided to take that original idea, the traveling company, but set it in a post-technological future. So
that's how you got to pandemics.
Yeah, that was how I got to pandemics.
That's so interesting because when you read it, you just think that that you were trying to write a book about a post-apocalyptic future.
I so wasn't.
And then that Shakespeare was the thing that came in to save civilization or whatever.
No, Shakespeare came first. What's funny is that the pandemic is almost incidental to the plot. Where I just wanted to get to this post-technological future, which is to say a post-apocalyptic future. And spelling this out makes me sound like a psychopath, but if you're trying to get to your post-apocalypse, you got to end the world somehow. So I went with a pandemic because it seemed horribly effective. But
It really did work,
it did.
right?
It worked. Yeah.
When
It
you
turned
take
out
it to the
like,
extent you did, right?
yeah, that was pretty extreme. I probably didn't need to take it quite that far, but that was what I was thinking there.
It's interesting. The way you describe that, it does center technology more than I expected you to say. Because I've actually heard you describe your ambivalence to technology.
I do have some ambivalence.
Can
Yeah.
you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. A much more eloquent writer than me summed up this ambivalence a number of years ago. Patrick Modiano, the French writer who won a Nobel Prize in literature a few years ago, in his acceptance speech, he talked about a kind of loss of space and privacy. There's something that our technology has done to us where it's eroded a sense of sort of personal mental space. We're much more likely to immediately do the thing, whether that's expressing a thought on social media or instantly texting a friend. It seems to me there's sort of less space in our lives for privacy, our private thoughts. The idea of having, if you say a secret life, that sounds quite negative, as if you had a mistress or something. But the idea of having an element of privacy and secrecy and kind of space in your life, I do feel a certain loss there. I sometimes resent having the internet in my pocket. These phones are designed to be addictive. They absolutely work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's why you see so many attempts to regulate our use of these things, like the Freedom app, for example, which will shut down certain websites for a set period of time. We're kind of desperate to limit our access to this kind of unending stream of information. And that does create a certain stress in our lives that, I'm sure my parents wouldn't have felt when they were my age. But on the other hand, it is extraordinary. I have to travel a lot for work, and I'm so grateful for FaceTime. It's amazing to get to talk to my partner and my kid when I'm outside the city and connect with friends so easily. So, yeah, I think like a lot of us, I love it and also sometimes really dislike it.
Yeah, I feel identically, and the surveillance piece is a core of it. There's no question, and that something is clearly lost when we think we're being watched. Like, it changes our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if when you build characters in a world without technology, do you think about how their behavior is pure almost, or like unmitigated, or these are core human choices as opposed to ones that are nudged? Or
It's really interesting. I think less about that than I do about the way technology influences plot. Where, think of the plot of how many classic novels and movies, how much depends on character A not knowing where character B is.
totally.
And like now you've got to account for the phone. It's like you have to go through all these like elaborate somersaults. His phone was dead and that's why he couldn't call Clarice, whatever it was.
Yeah.
So it just becomes this
why
kind of
can't she just text him?
yeah, why can't you just text him? Exactly. Why would he have to find a phone booth? It's like, so, yeah, the way it just, it makes certain plots more difficult. And, I was thinking about in your intro when you were talking about my first three novels as being set in the present day and the way that fiction becomes a time capsule kind of inevitably. My first novel, Last Night in Montreal, I published that book in 2009. So I'd finished writing it by the end of 2007. I was not on social media at that point, and it was kind of a different world in some ways. I didn't have to account for, well, why isn't she on Instagram? Things like that. So in a way, that wasn't that dissimilar.
Like, why can't he find her? Like, he should
why can't
be
he
able
find
to
her?
find
Exactly.
her.
Just
it shouldn't
look
be
her
that
up.
hard.
Exactly. Yeah, put an air tag on her.
Well, and doing what she was doing would have been harder too, right?
Absolutely,
Constantly
yeah.
disappear. Like, you can't disappear now in the same way you
No,
could
that's
then.
not really a thing. And it's possible it wasn't then. I don't know that I did that much research, but yeah, less of a thing now.
So why have you stayed in the world of speculative fiction then? And what are you drawn to the imagining these really different futures?
It feels a little bit accidental. So I wrote Station 11, which I'd say about 60% of that book is set in the future, the rest in the present day. My next book was The Glass Hotel, which was set mostly 2008 in the context of the economic collapse in the US around that time. That book came out, The Glass Hotel, came out in March 2020. So I canceled a 25-city tour. I was just on Zoom every night, promoting this book in the early days of the
Zoom
pandemic.
book tours were really
Zoom
something.
book tours.
That was a moment.
Yeah, it was a moment. It was kind of great in a way because we were so isolated. We were so scared in New York. It was just a horrible time. But getting to go online every night and talk about books with people who didn't live in your household, like that was amazing. I kind of loved that. Yeah,
Me too.
so
I had a young son at the time of COVID, and it for some people it was incredible.
yeah,
And Zoom was a liberating technology. It was a humanizing technology.
absolutely. Yeah, my daughter was 4, and
Okay, yeah, mine too.
yeah, and it's like you know how intense that was, like trying to work without childcare, and just like how crazy the day was. I'm grateful that I got so much time with her. But yeah, getting to talk to adults about books in the evenings, like that was magical. So that's the context that starts to set up Sea of Tranquility, which is it was this god awful time. There were a couple of really bad weeks in April 2020 in New York when around 700 people died every single day. So just the soundscape was ambulance sirens, 2 or 3 at a time, and it's easy to forget this now, but just the fear back then, we didn't know if it would affect our kids or what that could look like or when this would end. So I remember just being desperate for some kind of escape. I think that I'd always been a little bit afraid that if I wrote too far into the future, or it was too sci fi, that I might not be taken seriously as a literary novelist. But that was just such a horrible time. I just had this feeling like, F it, I'm just going to write whatever I want. So
And if that's the moon, it's going to be
yeah,
the
yeah,
moon.
exactly. And, enter the time traveling detective who lives on the moon. So, we were a little deranged in 2020. And that was the atmosphere that spawned Sea of Tranquility. I don't know that I would stay in speculative fiction indefinitely. The book I'm working on now is a bit speculative, but I don't know if the one after that will be.
You mentioned a minute ago being worried about how doing science fiction would be perceived. Like, how do you view science fiction versus speculative fiction and your place in those? Would you call yourself a science fiction writer now, and how do you view that genre?
You know, I think my favorite way to think about genre at this point is I love the idea that a book and a writer can be more than one thing. So, Sea of Tranquility is probably the most obvious example. That book has historical fiction, autofiction, literary fiction, detective fiction, and sci fi, I would say. Station 11 is speculative fiction and literary fiction. For myself, the books I've written set in the future don't feel to me to be fundamentally different than the books set in the present. So, I'm absolutely a speculative or sci fi writer. I'm also a literary fiction writer.
I mean, I mentioned in the introduction this idea that so much of our present technology has been imagined in science fiction before, and
Yes.
it is kind of incredible, right? That like it almost becomes a trope that like some guy, and usually it's a guy in their early 20s, reads some work of science fiction and decides they want to try and build some component of that world that has been imagined by someone else. And so science fiction has a very literal implication on what we're
Yeah.
building. And I wonder if that's something you think about or what you think. And because AI really is that now, right? Like we're building this thing that we are imagining what it could be, but that imagining is not done by us. It was done by science fiction writers who've been writing about this possibility for 20 years, right? So how do you think about that?
I think of it's really interesting because science fiction can absolutely be a blueprint. What's fascinating is the way that's kind of a neutral. Like it's not always a positive or always a negative. There's a very, very dark kind of aspect of this that I've been thinking about lately. So, I was born and raised in Canada, but I've lived in the United States, since my early 20s. The political situation in the United States is so dark. Like I cannot overexpress how bleak it feels sometimes. And there's this new kind of terrible strain following the fall of Roe v. Wade, which was, of course, the American Supreme Court decision that protected abortion across the country, where it feels to me sometimes like the far fringes of the Republican Party read The Handmaid's Tale and they were like, we want that. Like Gilead sounds awesome. So that's how it feels down here in terms of this kind of ever increasing control of women, women and girls not having the right to choose whether they have a child or not, and the horrible implications of that. Like, we're talking about 12-year-olds in some situations. So that's kind of the darkest possible vein where it feels like an entire political party was inspired by a dystopia. On the positive side, I feel that AI is something of a neutral where I understand the practical implications, which I think could be incredibly beneficial. If AI could read test results in a more accurate way so that cancers are caught sooner, like that, that would be worth almost anything. At the same time, as I mentioned, I do some TV writing. My union, the WGA, Writers Guild of America, was on strike for much of last year, and AI was the sticking point. Like,
We
that
all
was,
experienced the implications of
yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly. The current TV season is rough.
I know, it's horrible.
It's horrible out there. It's like, yeah, there's nothing going on. But yeah, like one of the major sticking points had to do with the minimum size of a writer's room. And at first I didn't get it. It honestly kind of felt like an overreach to me. It was like, well, how can you say that you have to hire a minimum number of people? Like, if the job can be done by 5 people, why are you saying you need 7? And then someone explained to me, no, the point is AI, that for these studios to save money, there was this kind of not very secret line of thinking among studios and streamers that perhaps the ideal size for a writer's room wouldn't be 5 or 7 or 10 people, which is what it is, generally speaking. It might just be AI plus a showrunner.
And do they need a physical space at all?
Do they need a physical space? Could be Zoom. It could be Chat GPT plus a guy in his basement. So, and look, like, I'm sure you could create some mediocre TV, with that formula. Yeah. So
That's interesting. Do you think there's a limit then to like the quality of things that can be produced with these technologies at the moment?
I think, yeah, I do. On their own, showrunners. Just to explain the term to people who are aren't steeped in this world, that's what it sounds like. It's the person running the show. But they're typically very experienced writers. They might have a decade of experience writing for television. So I fully believe that if an AI were to produce a very mediocre piece of writing, a showrunner could probably make it good. But it's like there's a human cost here. It's like it's just increasing wealth disparities. It means that a hypothetical 7 or 8 or 9 writers are out of a job. So, it's like the thing that nobody asked for except the billionaires is how it feels like in my industry.
And in mine too, in academics and journalism and teaching, it's all sort of, it feels like this is an encroachment of one's core identity or capacity or place.
Absolutely. And this feeling that the AI is doing the wrong jobs, where it's like, can AI just go solve homelessness in Los Angeles? Like, come up with a 20-point plan that analyzes tax codes.
And cure cancer and...
Yeah, exactly. And we'll write the screenplays, but if they could just take care of the mundane tasks, that would be nice.
Yeah. So why don't you think AI can produce a good novel, for example? What is it about the process that's fundamentally human?
It's just, by its very nature, it's not creating something original. It's kind of a mashup. I know that 3 of my novels were fed to OpenAI and Meta.
How do you know that?
There was a database that the Atlantic published
you were in
where
that.
you could search. It was a weird combination of novels. It was like Station 11, The Singer's Gun, and some other random early one.
And I wonder why some and not other. Like, why not?
I don't know.
They must have bought some rights or not bought. They must have acquired some.
Copied and pasted.
Yeah. Found in a database.
Exactly. Found is a nice way of putting it. I don't know. It's just, maybe it's more that I can't trust the originality. It's like, whose words am I actually reading? It's just all this stolen work that's kind of been fed into machine. I could see it being interesting, but it's like, I guess it doesn't feel original because there's no author or there's too many authors. I need to think this one through a bit more.
Yeah, I have a similar feeling, and I feel that there's something human about the generative task of taking a thought and turning it into prose.
Yeah.
And there's something about that act, and why the term even generative AI strikes such a chord with me is that it's replacing something really that is human in a way.
Yeah. And there's something almost offensive about that verb, isn't it? It's like, we're not generating content. We're creating art, or we're writing a novel, or writing a paper. It's like it's very dehumanizing.
I recently interviewed Joshua Bengio, who's from Montreal. He's one of the computer scientists who's like most responsible, I think, for this moment of AI. And he's now terrified of it.
Interesting.
He thinks AI presents an existential risk to humanity. And one of the core problems he sees is that we can't even imagine what an AI is, because it ultimately will be smarter than us. And I wonder if there's a possibility for, one, what did you think of that idea? I thought you might have some interesting thoughts on that. But also, like, is there something we can do to help imagine that future? And is that kind of a science fiction task that hasn't been properly deployed yet?
I love that question. You know, the movie Her a few years ago, I thought addressed this in a really intelligent way. Maybe we can't fully address it because we can't fully understand it. It seems to me to have been a terrible idea to make an entity that's smarter than us. It's like,
It feels risky, that's for
it
sure.
feels very high
It's a
risk.
bit of a roll of the dice.
Yeah, and if you want to tell me it's high reward, then great. But let's not deny that's
Well, if it cures cancer, maybe.
I mean, that would be nice. Yeah, yeah, we'd all appreciate that. I don't know. It's hard to even wrap my head around it. Yeah, I think I'd have to think about it a lot more before putting it in fiction. But it's also something that it's like it feels like one of the most annoying parts of my professional life is having to deal with AI. So I think that's why I'm not drawn toward writing about it in fiction. It's just
I get it.
yeah, it's like I went on strike against this. I don't really want to deal with it on the page.
Well, unless you can play a role in like I actually think there's an incredibly powerful role right now that writers play in imagining these futures. And I like there is, not that you necessarily see your job as like saving humanity from a potentially nefarious technology, but like we're building technologies in part following the guide of writers. I mean, it's wild, but it's true.
It is wild.
In Sea of Tranquility, a character is talking about what it's like to live on a moon colony and says that it was neither dystopian nor utopian. It just sort of was. So do you think we spend too much time thinking about these radical utopian or dystopian futures?
I think the radical dystopian and utopian futures are really interesting and actually important to think about. Like I mentioned The Handmaid's Tale earlier, and I think that was a really important book. I think that it frames the current moment in the United States in kind of a chilling but also clarifying way. When I think about the future though, I feel like yeah, this condition of it being awful in some ways and great in others, which is to say kind of like the present moment in a lot of ways. I think that's a very plausible scenario. It seems to me that usually our lives are not dystopian or utopian. And the moments when they're dystopian, that's enough of an event that we remember it as an historical moment. Moments like, the darkest days of what it was like living under communism in East Germany. That's like something they have museums about, this kind of extreme dystopia. It's hard to think of a utopian example in this moment, human nature being what it is. But
Yeah.
for me, that's a very plausible kind of future. Just this idea that it's probably not amazing all the time or horrible all the time, but it's mostly in this kind of in between. And with that as the backdrop, then it kind of becomes about how we respond to these technologies and, what it's like traveling through time, for example, or living in a sort of simulated atmosphere of a moon colony.
Yeah. You mentioned The Handmaid's Tale there, and I think part of what makes, I mean, there's multiple things it feels to me that make that so resonant now. I mean, obvious, first and foremost, as you say, the actual replication, it seems, of the sort of dystopian policies, but also technology's omnipresent in that narrative, and like the warning about surveillance and monitoring. And you're seeing that play out now too when you're talking about potential surveillance of app use of girls and movement, surveillance of movement across state lines. And as you said right off the start, the way the data that's collected about us and our behavior inside the digital ecosystem is itself a place of control, one of overt manipulation, but also of surveillance and softer control. And we're seeing that play out, I think, in real ways.
Absolutely. We are seeing it played out. And, I think of that even in the most mundane day to day things we experience in that vein, like the Instagram algorithms.
Yeah.
That algorithm has my number. It's like every ad that comes up, I'm like, that is the perfect pair of boots. I do kind of need that jacket. It's disturbing. There's a profile of me
I
that's
need it.
extremely accurate.
This
Yeah,
is
exactly. It's like, yeah, that is the necklace that's missing from my look.
Totally. Yeah, and that, I mean, what's flattening about these technologies is it's the same technology used to target you for that necklace as is used to target your vote or to nudge your vote or to
Yes,
nudge your
absolutely.
thought on a political issue or an ad camp, right? These are all the same tools.
Yeah, exactly. It's all those tools. And then if you add in, a bad actor, if you have, say, a disinformation campaign coming from overseas or as the United States, calls coming from inside the house a lot of the time. Yeah, that just pushes it in such a dark direction so quickly.
So just bouncing around a little bit more, but in Sea of Tranquility, you raise the possibility that we're living in a simulation, and you seem to be drawn by some of that simulation theory work, which is kind of
Hmm.
an act of speculative science fiction in
Absolutely. Yeah.
itself, right?
Yeah. That's a fun field.
It's trying to ground it in a theory, but it really is just an act of speculation, right? And one of the characters says, "A life lived in a simulation is still a life." What did you mean by that?
Um, what I meant by that is so to back up a little bit, the reason why the simulation hypothesis is in Sea of Tranquility is because time travel fiction doesn't really work. It's like you think it through for 5 seconds, and it's like, wait, every time a traveler went back in time, the slightest change would alter all of human history. So I thought maybe the best way to solve for that problem would be to add this whole other layer of science fictional technology. So enter the simulation hypothesis. There's a principle in TV writing that I really enjoy. It's called hanging a lantern on it. And the idea is that if you have a bit of a plot problem or, some other gap in the narrative, having a character point that out can be oddly effective. So in Sea of Tranquility, in the far future timeline with the time machine, that's why I have a guy standing next to a time machine saying, we don't understand why time travel works. We think the fact that it works at all might be evidence that we're living in a simulation. So, yeah, so the simulation hypothesis is there to solve a technical problem with time travel narratives. But then as I was thinking about it, I found myself thinking, well, what is a simulation? Because also, those cities that I describe on the surface of the moon, these moon colony cities with domes over them and controlled atmospheres, that's a kind of simulation too. Everything's kind of artificially generated. But how different is that from a modern day city where, water just comes out of taps and a lot of things are artificial around us too? It would be crazy to say that the lives we live in these cities are somehow less real than the lives that our ancestors lived kind of in wilderness. So then if you extrapolate that forward, if a life lived in New York or Toronto or Montreal is not less real than a life lived in the country, then I think a life lived in the artificial bubble of a moon colony is not less real than, a life lived in Montreal or Toronto or New York. And you think, well, I think a life lived in a simulation is still a life. I think we're still us. And, as I was thinking about that, just what I found myself thinking about a lot is what are the practical implications of all of our reality being a simulation or not? And I eventually came to the same point my character does, which is that I don't think it matters. It's like if you think about it, we know that our fellow humans can feel pain, which is in and of itself an argument for kindness and care and the way we treat each other. I don't think it matters whether we're living out these lives in a simulation or in reality, whatever that is.
Yeah, such an interesting answer. And I think part of simulation theory is that it's binary. You're either in it or you're not, in a way,
Yeah,
right? So we're
right.
either all in a simulation, in which case, like, well, it's all we got. So we're human, or whatever we are in
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
right? What I worry a bit more about is some of our transition to virtual
Hmm.
things, whether it's more of our lives being mediated on social media or more and more of our engaging with AIs and artificial life forms. And I feel that slow transition doesn't necessarily give us a chance to think about what we might be losing in that process. And is that something you worry about here too?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I listened to a slightly terrifying podcast episode the other day. I wish I could remember the podcast, but it was somebody who'd run an experiment where he trained an AI to be him, basically. Like he'd fed it information and given it the kind of digital blueprint of his voice and had it start making phone calls for him. And his friends who worked in the field immediately knew it wasn't him. You know, you listen to the recording and he introduces himself and they just start laughing. But I listened to it and I thought, well, I would have been tricked. I don't know this guy. You know, if he called me, I would have assumed I was speaking to a human. So that occurred to me as something that I guess now we have to start worrying about. You know, if we're in a Zoom meeting, are we actually speaking to people or are we speaking to their AI avatars at this point? And I don't know how to fix that or like what the test is for it. You know, do you call your friend at the beginning of every day and say, you know, our passcode for the day is X? And if you can't,
Yeah.
you know, if you can't tell me X on Zoom, I'll know it's not you.
And you like mail it to them or something?
Exactly. Yeah. You know, write it on a piece of paper and hand it to them. Like that's inconvenient. Yeah. So I don't know how we screen for this or if we'll just kind of get better at it, if it'll become a skill that we learn.
Yeah, I worry that we're not like people building these technologies fall back on that, and I worry that we won't be able to know, and that's where the real slippery slope begins. I think we're still probably in a place where we can generally know, but we're right on the edge of that, of losing that capacity, and that might just be a moment we're in, right?
Yeah, so 5 years from now, it could be absolutely impossible to tell the difference. And oh my God, the loneliness of that. Like, imagine realizing you're the only human in the Zoom meeting and nobody else is there. That's kind of devastating, actually.
It's devastating, and yet it's aspirationally being built as if it's a positive,
I
right? That we can
know, I
replace,
know.
we can have our sit in where I wouldn't have to be talking to you.
Yeah, you could be on the beach and your avatar could be talking to me about
And I would have
technology.
programmed it to like the questions I wanted to ask, and but like what would be lost there, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned loneliness, and I interviewed a woman who built a technology called Replica. And her name's Eugenia Quida, and it's basically an AI chatbot that becomes your friend over time.
Oh, I've heard about that.
And yeah, and it's worth. She's very, very thoughtful. I came in with a very dystopian view of this. Like, this just sounds horrendous to me. But her motive for it is that we're lonely,
Yeah.
and that actually having someone we can dialogue with that cares and that understands our context and our lives can actually get at some of that really human emotion of loneliness and help us in some meaningful way, particularly lonely times in our life or sad times in our life. And that something about that's convincing too, right?
Yeah, it is. Where it's like, you know, I've been engaged in this pretty conscious project over the past couple of years to find more friends. Because you know, New York's one of those places that people leave. Like they do their time here, then they go somewhere else. So it's like,
I did. Spent 3
yeah,
years
yeah,
and left
exactly, exactly. So you know,
as soon as I
people,
had a kid.
yeah, yeah, it's a very common trajectory. You know, people come to town, they do their time, and then they get out because this place is so expensive and hard to live in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, so I'd lost a number of friends, and lost is the wrong word. A number of friends had departed the city, just, you know, gradual attrition. I'd lost other friends because I got a divorce, and if you leave, you're the villain. That's my experience. So I found myself in this weird moment of realizing I didn't really have that many friends, and I was kind of lonely. So I've been very consciously trying to seek out friends over the past couple of years. But as I think about that in the context of what you were just saying with this woman who's developed this chatbot, I've had a lot of privilege in that because I do work in television some of the time, and that is a very social workplace. And at this point, a lot of my friends are fellow TV writers. And, we're kind of thrown together for 8 or 10 or 20 weeks. And it's pretty intense. You learn a lot about your coworkers in that time. So it's a great basis for friendships. And at this point, there are a lot of people, mostly in LA, but also New York, who I can text and, they'll text back. But that's so privileged, socially speaking. Like, there are a lot of people I know who have much more isolated lives. So yeah, maybe for me to say, well, it's a little bit disturbing and lonely to think about talking to a chatbot, which is to say talking to somebody who isn't there. Maybe sometimes you just got to take what you can get, and that's better than feeling completely alone with nobody to talk to.
Yeah, I agree. And I wonder at what point that breaks, though, right? Like when do we lose something rather than gain something? And maybe that's what we don't know yet.
Maybe it is. And also, like, there's no kind of next step where it's like, I'll text my friends and then we'll meet for dinner. And meeting for dinner will be absolutely lovely. But yeah, with your chatbot, you never get past the texting part.
Right. Although they are now building hologram projection versions of the avatars in replica so that they can sit with you on your couch and watch TV with you at home and have dinner with you in your house. And
God, that's disturbing. Okay.
Yeah. So there's always a solution to these problems, clearly. Well, to move away from like the purely dystopian, I mean, you're ultimately, and just to come full circle, a lot of your characters and your stories are based in some sense of hope. I mean,
yeah.
Whenever I feel really sad or depressed reading any of these narratives, often there's saved by some glimmer of humanity from a person. And so where does your hope come from in this?
The hope in the books is partly just kind of a conscious, I don't want to say technical choice because that's a little bit too cold, but if a book is unrelentingly bleak, I find it a bit unreadable. Or, maybe a better way to put this, when I was writing Station 11, I was very conscious that the world does not need another version of The Road, Cormac McCarthy's novel. And that's a weird thing to say about a book that I loved. I absolutely loved The Road. I will never read it again. You don't need to experience that twice. For me, there's something, I guess, more interesting in kind of a mixed state where it's like, if there's darkness and horror, there should also be glimmers of light and also some funny moments. Like, I feel like that just kind of makes for a better book overall. So, yeah, so that's how I think of it. Hope and just the way I think about the world and my life, I kind of feel like as the future unfolds, fundamentally we'll still be us with all the negative and positive things that implies. So, we'll still treat each other horribly, but we'll also still treat each other well. There will still be moments of humanity.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The president of Paradigms is James Millward. Special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show to as many people as possible.